Welcome to Experts Dispatch, your go-to source for in-depth discussions on critical national and global issues. I'm Mary Hunter, a visiting research fellow at the Centre for Strategic and Contemporary Research and a PhD graduate from the University of St Andrews. Today I'm discussing the history of UK-Pakistan bilateral relations with Professor Ian Talbot. The UK and Pakistan have a complex relationship, in large part due to the British Empire's colonisation of what is now Pakistan. With Pakistan's independence in August 1947, bilateral diplomatic ties were established between the two countries. Until the introduction of Pakistan's first constitution in 1956, rendering it an Islamic republic, Pakistan remains a dominion of the British Empire. Pakistan is a member of the Commonwealth, though it left in 1972 over the British stance towards the independence and recognition of Bangladesh, erstwhile East Pakistan. It later rejoined in 1989. This shared history of connections between the two countries, in addition to Pakistan's significant geographical location, cooperation in a number of areas, and the significant Pakistani diaspora in the UK, are in part why they have such an interesting and complicated relationship. Joining me today to discuss this history is Professor Ian Talbot. Professor Talbot is an Emeritus Professor in the History of Modern South Asia at the University of Southampton. He was also the head of the History Department and founding director of the Centre for Imperial and Postcolonial Studies at the same university. Besides a number of academic posts at other higher education institutions in the UK, Professor Talbot was a senior visiting research fellow at Harvard University's South Asia Institute from 2018 to 2019. His research areas include the history of colonial Punjab and of Pakistan. Thank you, Professor, for taking part in today's Experts Dispatch, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. In 2021, you had a book published entitled The History of British Diplomacy in Pakistan, and in it you talk about the activities of the British High Commission in Pakistan from 1947 till 2008. I wondered if you might start by summarising some of the main themes and findings of your book.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about British diplomacy in Pakistan and to reflect on that book. There are three themes really in it. The first is the role of the High Commission and the heads of the mission in furthering British diplomatic, commercial, and strategic interest in Pakistan. The High Commission assisted in this task, which of course the task was set by London, but the High Commission assisted through six main functions. Firstly, it reported back to London, giving political analysis of developments and individuals within Pakistan. Secondly, it provided briefings when British ministers went to visit Pakistan. Thirdly, of course, it hosted social functions with local politicians, elites, diplomats, fellow diplomats. Fourthly, members of the High Commission toured quite extensively in Pakistan. Fifthly, the High Commission would issue press releases. I suppose in the modern era, this has been taken over by social media activities. And then finally, of course, there's the more basic routine consular activities, which the High Commission was involved in. So, the beginning of the volume, I set out these are the roles which the High Commission are fulfilling in order to further British interests in the country. The second theme running through the volume is how these functions operated in different historical periods. And of course, in order to do that, you have to give the reader some insights into Pakistan's history as well as British history. So there's that background that also runs through the volume, how things have changed in terms of Britain as its power began to decline in the world, how Pakistan changed as it moved from democracy through to the first coup in 1958, then to the breakup of the country in 1971, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's period of rule, which, as you already introduced, took Pakistan out of the Commonwealth. And of course, the High Commission then has its role transformed to that as an embassy with an ambassador rather than a high commissioner. And then, of course, the more modern period, the consolidation of democracy post-Zia in the 1990s and leading up, of course, to the war on terror. And that is really the final chapter. Two chapters look at that period of time, really cutting off around about 2008. So I'm looking at how these functions operate in these very different contexts and how the functions may be transformed by technological developments. I've already mentioned social media, how political changes in Pakistan may also lead to new priorities, new emphases, and of course the emergence of a diaspora, a large Pakistani community in Great Britain, that also changes very much the functions of the High Commission in the more modern era. And then the other theme which runs through the volume is the cooperation, sometimes competition, but more often cooperation between the British and American diplomatic missions in Pakistan. And how Britain, of course, moves from the former colonial power to, by the mid 1950s, increasingly a junior partner with the US in pursuing Western interests in Pakistan. And of course, American interests sometimes have the global Cold War perspective, which make them different perhaps than the more Commonwealth
And
orientated
this might
British
be
interests. So
difficult to
Britain and
address
America
kind of
don't always
comprehensively in the time that we
look
have,
at
but
Pakistan through
do
the
you think
same
you could
prism
identify what some of the most
and have
significant
exactly
moments
the same
were in this
understandings
history
of
of
Pakistan. And of course,
UK-Pakistan
Britain
bilateral
also had
relations,
the
and how you think
advantages,
those moments have affected
though
the
they could in
development of
different
that relationship?
circumstances have been disadvantages of colonial background and rule. And of course, Britain has ruled the former uh, British India. Obviously, areas which were to become Pakistan were important to Britain strategically. The Pakistan background of Punjab is something which I explore in other studies, but comes out also in this volume. So that's really the context of what the book is about, and it brings out a very, just to conclude quickly, a sort of nuanced view of Britain's interests, how they may have differed from America, Britain's influence, which is quite remarkable in some respects, given that the other big players are in the interested in Pakistan and have perhaps more physical resources uh, than Britain to deploy. In recent years, of course, China, but in previous periods, obviously America. So that's the context really for the volume. I mean, there are significant moments in all these three periods. I think probably the easiest way to look at it is the early period, first decade or so. What were the significant moments then? Then take it forward to the period perhaps of the Ayub Khan's martial law, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and then look at the contemporary era. Because you could pick out and say there's significant moments throughout, the last 70 odd years. So in the first period, I mean, what happens, of course, is that Britain tries to have a balancing act with both India and Pakistan in the Commonwealth, and it attempts to balance its interests between these two countries, which to an extent I think disappoints Pakistan, because Pakistan uh, was looking to Britain in the early years to either itself or lead a Commonwealth mediation of the Kashmir issue. Uh, and Britain isn't really able to do that because of its attempt at a balanced role. And in a sense, of course, the other thing that Pakistan was looking for in the early years was financial assistance. And again, post Second World War, Britain has less resources than it may have previously had to do this. So there's this movement in this early period in which America becomes more important, perhaps, to Pakistan in terms of aid and development than Britain. Uh, and Britain is sort of struggling to maintain its position in this period. Yet, on the whole, there are still very close relationships, both between British military elites and the emerging Pakistan military elites. There's close relations between some of the high commissioners themselves who have served in India and know the leading political figures in the Pakistan area very well. So that, in a way, there's a transition. That's the way I would look at this first period as a period of transition. Martial law, of course, brings in a very new set of circumstances. How does Britain balance its concern for democracy with this new regime? Is Ayub Khan going to bring stability? Because, of course, the final years leading up to the coup were pretty chaotic politically. So is this actually seen as something which is positive or not? Certainly in this period, I think relations are quite warm early on in the Ayub regime, but then they begin to cool down and take a nosedive really after 1965 and the war between India and Pakistan. Up until that point, though, Britain had shown it could still mediate in the Ran of Kutch episode, which is a precursor, if you like, to the war based on Kashmir, is mediated to a large extent by Britain, not by any other power, and is moderated by Britain. So Britain can still play a role as a mediator. It can still provide some assistance, but it's doing it in a very different environment to previously. If you look at the more contemporary period, again, there's a concern for stability in South Asia in terms of relations between Pakistan and India as a factor. Again, there's concern for democracy and to try and build up democracy. There's the Commonwealth link on and off. Obviously, for many years, Pakistan is no longer in the Commonwealth after leaving in January 72. And it's one of the longest gaps in Commonwealth history before it's readmitted under Benazir Bhutto. But the more modern period begins with that concern with democracy, stability in Pakistan, and in a sense drawing a line under the Zia period. Then, of course, there's this great sort of transformation coming out of 9/11 and the consequences of that. And Britain becomes quite significant in terms of its role and positioning in Pakistan. The High Commission in Pakistan during these years is the largest one in the country, all the countries of the world globally. And it becomes much more complex operation for the High Commissioner to manage it, because you get people who are not just foreign diplomats, but from DFID. You get people who are coming in from defense, who are also involved in
This final
the
question will perhaps
High
reflect
Commission.
more of
So it
my
becomes a more
research
complex and
interests in
much
the
larger
UK-Pakistan relationship.
operation, but at the same time,
But
it
I
becomes
wanted
more
to ask how you think
securitized.
it might be
So it becomes
affected by
more
more frequent
shut
discussions
off
about the
from
realities of
ordinary
the history of the British
Pakistanis because
Empire,
of the security concerns
especially
post
requests for
9/11. So
apologies and
that
reparations in
it's a
light
very
of
different
that history
atmosphere
by formerly
in
colonised
the
countries.
High
Do
Commission
you think that these
in this
discussions will
period of
impact the
time than
relationship,
had
and
happened
if so, how?
previously. And I try and bring that out, but also look at the way in which new technology enables some of these activities to still continue um, by going online. For example, a lot of what we would call now British public diplomacy activities around the British Council go online at this time, as it becomes more difficult uh, to maintain a presence in the centres of cities. So that's really some of the key moments and the repercussions that come out of it. So it's a fluctuating relationship. I think that's important. On the whole, though, you must say that despite ups and downs, it's a more positive relationship than perhaps the Americans, with far more resources at their disposal, are able to achieve. I mean, in some senses, the situation is much more complex. Uh, the colonial inheritance for Pakistan and other countries, because Britain enables the creation of Pakistan when it does divide and quit British India in 1947. Obviously, aspects of how that was handled, are very controversial. The timing of decolonisation, whether that contributed to the violence and the upheaval, the Gurdaspur district being given to India despite being slightly Muslim majority area. There's the aspect also did generally in terms of the boundary award Mountbatten privilege India because of his close relations with Nehru over Pakistan. So there's this aspect of it, but generally in the past, the criticism has been around Mountbatten as an individual rather than the British state per se, in terms of how decolonisation was handled at that moment of time. And of course, whilst if you look more broadly at the longer span of the British ruling presence in the areas which became Pakistan, you can obviously see areas where Muslim communities suffered as a result of colonial exploitation, which is common to other areas of the subcontinent. Some communities actually gained because, of course, again, going back to my long term interest in Punjab becomes the sword arm, to use the cliche, of the British Indian Army. So that leads to lots of communities securing employment and rewards subsequent to their military experience. There's also, of course, the Canal Colony development in that area, which again makes fertile what had been a previously barren place. Uh, so one has to say that this is a complex picture. It's not all one of exploitation and Muslim suffering. Just as some Muslims certainly resisted British rule in Bengal, the jihad movements on the frontier, the Farazi movement in Bengal. Some Muslims were engaged in revolutionary activity, but not largely to the extent that you might get in other areas of India. So there's
Thank you
no
for that.
equivalent
And I'm
martyr
afraid
of
that's
like
all we
Bhagat
have time for
Singh,
today. Thank you
as
so much to
far as
Professor Ian
the
Talbot for
Muslim
joining me today to discuss the history
community
of
is
UK
concerned. So,
Pakistan
so that
bilateral
aspect
relations.
of
I look forward to
repression,
welcoming you to our next episode of Experts
leaves less
Dispatch. Bye for
scope
now.